Okay, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. It's delightful to have my friend Sherri Tracinski talking about her columns. She used to write a column called Things of Beauty. I'm delighted that she's here talking about that. Sherri, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So I thought it would be really good for me to start with a little bit of an introduction, even though many of us on this group here have been journeying through art and aesthetics for several weeks now. And we've referenced my old column, Things of Beauty, several times. But I don't think I ever really introduced myself or how that column came into being. So I thought I would start with that. So first about me, I'm an architect and I've always wanted to be an architect since probably I was about 12. It probably took me till adulthood to kind of really understand that other people might not want to be architects. It was that big of a draw for me. What I found most appealing about architecture is the connection between science and art, between the practical and the philosophical. Between the function and the form. And you'll notice that with many of my other loves, my other hobbies, they embody that same idea of combining technical skill and emotional or artistic skill, such as knitting, watercolors, graphic design, woodworking, baking. I always say baking is science experiments that you can eat, and music. So you'll see that thread running through all of my work. And I spent a few intense years learning how to write from a master who taught me how to put words to the thoughts in my head and always to push me to write in my own voice. I also thought that I should give a little history of how the Things of Beauty column began. It was about 15 to 20 years ago. I was helping Rob do some graphic design for his print publication. I was setting text and doing line editing and of course, reading all of his work on politics and cultural commentary and philosophy. And while I was learning a lot, God, politics is so ugly. And we also had a good friend of ours, Jack, he's an engineer. He would write articles for the publication that were full of facts and figures and graphs and detailed analysis of, things like the power industry. And they were great articles and highly informative and full of really great connections. But then one fateful day came when, after a full day of editing and page setting, exhausted and drained, I said to Rob, "Your articles are like the meat and potatoes that make up the main part of the meal. Jack's pieces are the Brussels sprouts or the kale salad that you should eat, and maybe you don't want to. But what you really need is some dessert to make this meal exciting. What you really need is some Things of Beauty." And truly, as simple as that, from that one comment, that's how the Things of Beauty column started. So if any of you were wondering why Shrikant's been advertising this event as a dessert tray, it was for that reason. But it was never intended to be just little fluffs of marshmallow or empty sugar calories. It needed to be something worthy of sitting beside those other really deep, in-depth analysis pieces, and needed to have a serious purpose for me. And what I was hoping to prove with each column was that beauty is everywhere. We just need to take the time and the effort to observe it. The column started out as a weekly thing. I think we probably did them on Fridays. And then it grew more frequently. And when I started looking for things to write about, I found myself with piles and piles of things to write about. Eventually, for a period of about 3 to 5 years, it was a daily column. And I can tell you that the daily act of writing the column had a profound effect on me, and it made me better at everything else that I did in my life. I stopped doing the column right before our children were born. And for the last several years, I've made some sputtering attempts to really get it rolling again, but other projects and demands have always made that difficult. And then sneaky Shrikant. I'm convinced this was his plot all along. He called me one day and said, "Oh, maybe you might possibly join us for an online discussion about Louis Sullivan." He knew I wouldn't be able to say no to that. And then he asked, how about you and I do a meetup about Louis Sullivan's ideas, form follows function? And how could I possibly say no? And then as the pandemic stretched onward, one Sullivan meeting became two, and then 12 to 14 weeks of Saturday meetups on art and aesthetics rolled along. And then here we are today doing a week's worth of Things of Beauty columns in one afternoon. So Shrikant, don't think that I don't know exactly what you're up to. I'm on to you now. It's only taken me, what, 3 months?
Thank you. Thank you.
But truth be told, with so much ugliness going on in the world, I needed this as much as everyone else. And apparently I needed Shrikant to tell me how much I enjoyed talking about art and aesthetics and beautiful things. And I needed that little extra push, that little extra kick to get the ball rolling. So that explains how this all started. But I also want to share its initial inspiration. Shrikant included this on his Meetup page, a part that I wrote about it, but in case anyone didn't get a chance to read through that piece, you'll find all the links on and the other images as we go on. Shrikant will link all these images later. So don't fret if you see something and say, I need to know where that link is. He'll put them all up. He chose not to do it yet because he doesn't want you sneaking off and checking things out ahead. So I thought perhaps I'd start by rereading an excerpt from the Keats poem Endymion. Sorry, my Greek's a little. It's a first segment from a much longer poem, but that is the part that's most widely remembered, and it's the inspiration for the title of this column. So, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Therefore, on every morrow, we are wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth, spite of despondence, of the human dearth of noble natures, or of the gloomy days, of all the healthy and unhealthy and over-darkened ways, made for our searching. Yes, in spite of it all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits, such the sun, the moon, trees old and young, sprouting a shady boon for a simple sheep. And such are daffodils with the green world they live in, and the clear rills that for themselves a cooling covert make against the hot season. The mid-forest brake, rich with its sprinkling of fair musk rose blooms, and such too is the grandeur of the dooms we have imagined for the mighty dead. All lovely tales we have heard or read, an endless fountain of immortal drink pouring onto us from the heaven's brink. Nor do we merely feel these essences for one short hour. No, even as the trees that whisper round a temple become soon dear as the temple's self, so does the moon, the passion posy, glories infinite, haunt us till they become a cheering light unto our souls, and bound us so fast that whether they'll be shine or gloom overcast, they will always be with us or we die. Therefore, 'tis with full happiness that I will trace the story of Endymion. The very music of the name has gone into my being, and each pleasant scene is growing fresh before me as the green of our own valleys. So I will begin now while I cannot hear the city's din. Now, while the early budders are just new and run in mazes of the yellow, youngest hue, about old forests, while the willow trails its delicate amber, and the dairy pails bring home increase of milk. And as the year grows lush in juicy stalks, I'll smoothly steer my little boat for many quiet hours, with streams that deepen freshly into bowers. Many and many a verse I hope to write before the daisies, vermeil rimmed and white, hide in the deep herbage, and ere yet the bees hum about the globes of clover and sweet peas. I must hear the middle of my story. Oh, may no wintry season, bare and hoary, see it half finished, but let autumn bold with universal tinge of somber gold be all about me when I make an end. And now at once adventuresome, I send my herald thought into wilderness. There let its trumpet blow and quickly dress my uncertain path with green, that I may speed easily onward through flowers and weed. So let's go back and take a look at some of the lines a little more carefully from the very first stanza. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Notice that Keats uses the phrase thing of beauty in a broad sense. He doesn't just mean a pretty flower, though he keeps coming back to flowers and nature imagery. The phrase a thing is our invitation to broaden that application of what is beauty. Keats is invoking it to refer to stories of great deeds as an introduction to his own retelling in the rest of the poem of the ancient Greek myth of Endymion. Past readers of this column know that I often include works of art in my idea of things of beauty, but I also spread its meaning to include well-made tools, photographs, inventions, everyday objects, and perhaps even a doorknob. So with that broadened category in mind, and with today's current unsettling crisis of global pandemic, reread that first stanza while holding in your own mind your chosen thing of beauty. And notice what Keats is saying. This value of yours brings you joy that increases the more you examine it. Its very existence works like a salve on your soul to bring you sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Then he turns our attention to the long-lasting effects. And I quote, nor do we merely feel these essences for one short hour. No, even as the trees that whisper round the temples become soon as dear as the temple's self, so does the moon, the passion posy, glories infinite, haunt us till they become a cheering light unto our souls, and bound us so fast that whether there be shine or gloom overcast, they must always be with us or we die. Notice the word choice that Keats uses in putting haunts us and cheering light in the same line. It's like unwanted ghosts that haunt your gloom. He's warning us that focusing on our values and those things that bring us joy, he's warning us that those very act of valuing will creep into our sense of life and create a cheering light. So reader beware, taking the conscious action of focusing on what gives you joy will cause a cheering light to seep into your soul that will remain with you no matter how gloomy or overcast things may be. And then later on, he writes, and now, at once adventuresome, I send my herald thought into the wilderness. There let its trumpet blow and quickly dress my uncertain path with green, that I may speed easily onward through flowers and weed. And with that beautiful thought, let us begin an adventure of things of beauty through the weedy times of this pandemic and onward into the flowering times that we all hope to see again. So I have 5 different things of beauty to show you, and we're going to be going back and forth between screen sharing and things that I'm just going to show you on the screen. And I think, Shrikant, did we decide we're going to do a pause for question after the end of each one?
Yes.
Okay, that'll allow me to get another drink of water.
Yep. What we can do is let's not take questions now, but let's take questions after the first thing.
After the first one. Did you feel that? Yeah. And then Rob is here on my side here going to do, yeah, there he is. He is running the screen share for me because I can't talk and do that at the same time. So can we screen share for this first one?
Yes. So let us, how do we, hold on, I have to find the screen sharing here.
No, don't stop video. Share screen,
Share
the big
screen.
green one.
Okay, and then we go to here. Share.
And then play. All right. So, and again, Shrikant's going to send you links to all these. This is called AGA, and am I pronouncing Korea?
As far as I know.
I could be mispronouncing their name. I apologize. AGA Korea, Correa and Sons. This is a company that makes jewelry, and this is their pendant called Center of Effort. This is a jewelry company centered around sailing and things and the love of all things sea and sailing. I've been a fan of their jewelry for many, many years, though I'm not a sailor. And 90% of my boating experiences have something to do with a paddle and not a sail. But I love the thought and the care that go into so many of their pieces. I also love the celebration of the tools of the sailing trade, like the celebration of the design of an anchor chain that keeps it from kinking and tangling on deck. And I love the way they celebrate very functional things as well, like rope and sailing knots. They do this by making rope out of gold and painstakingly tying their gold ropes into tiny little jewelry-sized knots. One of my favorites is their monkey fist cufflinks, and they make other things with monkey fist as well. I don't know if you're familiar with a monkey fist knot. It's a type of knot that looks really like a fist. It's got a lead weight on the inside with a rope tied in a knot around it so that you can use it when you're sailing, kind of like a weight at the end of a rope, and then you can retrieve it. I love knots, and I find these highly functional knots very beautiful, especially when they take them and make them out of gold and silver and lavish lots of attention on them. So when you take something functional like lead and hemp and you recreate it in gold or silver, it makes it particularly special. I've personally have a great love of wearing jewelry that's been made out of some nod to industry or tools or architecture in some way. Today I'm wearing earrings made out of concrete. That's another thing of beauty. For example, I have a pair of earrings that are made out of little roller bearings and actual industrial roller bearings. I have a pair of earrings that are tiny bubble levels that I wear at the beginning of every single project, but it's always funny because depending on how level I hold my head, I'm usually a half a bubble off. And I have a lovely collection of jewelry that references decorative arts or architecture in some way. So expect that I'll continue sharing these little finds in this column. But in the past, I've already talked about this company's monkey fist cufflinks and their anchor chain jewelry. So today I wanted to share you this one, their Center of Effort pendant. So to start with, I feel I should reiterate, I am not a sailor, and I need to send my apologies to John and to Nika, who are probably going to cringe if I take a few liberties with the meaning of center of effort. So the sailing concept of center of effort, best as I understand, is it's the point through which the sum of the driving forces acting on the sail appear to act in one spot. I think it can be thought of like the geometric center of the sail, but of course the sail changes shape depending on the wind, so the center of effort is constantly moving. We could get into the need to balance your center of effort with your center of lateral resistance in order to sail faster and more enjoyable through the water, but I would be talking way above my sailing knowledge, so we're not going to do that. So I'll tell you what I love about this idea. This particular site suggests that you interpolate your own definition to sweet spot or center of affection, both of which are pretty good ideas. But I like to take it to mean something more closely associated with its original meaning. I like to think of it as a daily personal question. What is the center of your driving force? What is it that defines who you are and what you hope to get out of your time on Earth? Are you daily taking notice of the force of your life is pushing in the right direction, pushing at that sweet spot, making the most of your effort? Or are you wasting precious time and effort letting your sails flap needlessly in the wind? Personally, I love the idea of taking the symbol as your personal driving force. If you happen to fiddle and finger with your keychain or your jewelry throughout your day, like many of you know I do, imagine what wearing a center of effort pendant could do for you. It would be a gentle and beautiful way to remind yourself of your own driving force every time your fingers happen to come across it. It would be a daily reminder that you must be quick to capture the changing winds and know how to make all the competing forces work to your best advantage and to get the most out of life. I find that very beautiful. You can stop share.
Stop share.
All right, so Shrikant?
Yes. So
I'm
if,
going to try to
I'm gonna
stop
try to
share, and we can take a couple quick
It
questions.
doesn't always want to stop the share. Do I have?
Yep, hang on.
sure, if anybody wants to ask questions, we have the following rules. Go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. Rule number 2, keep on topic. Rule number 3, questions only, just be brief so we can keep things moving. So no questions at this point. So let's continue.
Okay, all right. So this next one is called We See. You can see here, we, O-U-I-S-I. Can you see that? We See is a brand new visual card game. It started out last fall as a Kickstarter campaign. It's the brainchild of 2 New York photographers, Kaz Brecker and Paul Brillinger. My apologies if I've mispronounced their names. Anyway, they've created a deck of 210 cards. This is just some of them. There's 2 piles like this. They have no numbers on them. There are no suits, and all the cards are square. They're not rectangular, like a regular deck of cards. Each one has a beautiful photograph on it. That one has a flower. And they're usually really tight photos. Like here's one of almonds. Did I get that in the right? So, and it's just all sorts of different things. They're really tight photographs of the little things around us that we might not actually notice. The shadow cast by a fence, the texture of water on a road surface, the radiating pattern of a piece of broken glass, a hairy texture of a coconut, the flaky laminations of really good pastry, the texture of tree bark, the pattern of electrical power lines, of vibrant colors of a jar of colored pencils. These are the kinds of pictures you see. This first deck is their New York City deck, a nod for Shrikant. Nearly all the photos of all these 210 photos were taken in and around New York City. And I believe they have plans on making future decks on nature and architecture. So I'm really eager to see those created in the future. In the meantime, I couldn't help but jump on the chance to be one of the early purchasers. So for the past several weeks, many of us have come together this Saturday on these Saturday afternoons to talk about art and aesthetics. We've discussed ways you can train your abilities to notice things. One of the very reasons I originally started this column, Things of Beauty, was to show that beauty is all around us, but that we have to make the effort to notice it. It doesn't just come along and smack you in the head and say, hey, look at me. We each have to make the effort to see that beauty in the world. And if we never look for it, or egads, if we only look for the ugliness, that's exactly what you'll find in spades. So then along came these 2 photographers and their Kickstarter campaign. And from their book, their little instruction manual, they had this to say, and I quote, "Doesn't it feel like we're always glancing at our screens? Thousands of images flying at us each day. It's tough to slow down long enough to enjoy activities that harness curiosity. We See offers an antidote, reconnecting through play and the act of noticing. Did you hear that? The act of noticing. Let me continue. The photo cards capture small marvels in the urban everyday, a tiny weed in a sidewalk crack, colorful hydrants on a wall. Beauty is all around. We just need to choose to see it. I'm not making it up. That's exactly what it says in here. Did you hear that? Beauty is all around it. We just need to choose to see it. I mean, really, how on earth would I possibly resist that? So let me tell you a little bit about We See. First, I love their name. We, French for yes, and see, Spanish or Italian for yes, pronounced we see, meaning yes, yes. I really like that. So this deck of cards can be used in a huge variety of ways. You can play dominoes-like game. You can play competitively. You can play collaboratively. The manual has a whole bunch of different ways. I find it interesting that when we started playing it, we gravitated towards making obvious visual connections, like by type. So we had all the food items in one pile, all the plants in another, maybe everything that was yellow in another pile. Then play seemed to gravitate away from those obvious connections to more interesting and funny connections. Like there's a photo of a prickly cactus with 5 little cacti buds on top that look an awful lot like soft little baby's feet. The connection is funny because the shape connects the cactus and the baby's foot, but they're so opposite in texture. I noticed that once we started opening up to these more subtle visual connections, the play became much more interesting, and we began looking at the cards more carefully. We no longer oriented them the right way up automatically. We looked at them sideways and upside down and every which way. It didn't matter. Now we were noticing that this is not just a picture of a tree. We were noticing all the other details that had passed by before. So I love this set of cards because it can be used in so many different ways and for so many different age groups. So let me show you a handful of little connections. This is about 25 to 30 cards. Notice how these amazing photographs draw your eyes to those details by forcing our eyes to look carefully. Our brains want immediately to know what a thing is. And sometimes we're not given that opportunity. Sometimes the photographer isn't allowing us to know that much because they don't want us to know whether it's a tree or a leaf or a rusted bit of metal railing. But by zooming in really close, we miss the wider context and our attention is brought to those little details that the photographer wanted us to notice. So here's the cards that I pulled out and I'm going to share with you. This first one here is a set of piano keys. I had to do this for Lenora. And if you turn it upside down, you don't quite see it so much as piano keys, but shapes of black and white. And I thought that kind of went like with this one. This is a shadow on the sidewalk. So once I saw these shadows in the sidewalk in this pattern of black and white, I saw this pattern. And that's a zipper. And it's the pattern of this black and sort of tan color, very rigid, dot, 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 dot. And then I saw that. I think that's a parking garage. Probably goes like that, but I liked it like that. And when I was looking at that, I thought, wow, this dark pattern, light pattern, repeated, kind of looks like this. But this one's got more shape. And when I first looked at this particular card, I thought it was maybe pieces of fruit, maybe they're orange slices or mango slices or something like that. I didn't even realize at first that it's actually a dollop of meringue. But I like it this way because it shows you the shape. You see the shape of that more. And I saw that shape and I thought, that looks an awful lot like these chairs. Can you see these? So when I was looking at those, I thought, wow, all these fine little wires on these chairs looks a lot like that. These fine little hairs sticking up in all directions. That reminds me an awful lot of this power line. And then that power line, this one's for you, Maritza. Reminds me of that beautiful shadow of the tree on the sidewalk. Again, we're still in this pattern of dark against white. And then I saw this. And I'm not sure if that's a chair or what, but they remind me a lot of each other. When I saw that, then my eye noticed that radiating pattern. And I saw it in the tops of these. So I have this upward. No, hang on, we go this way. The tops of these water jugs. They have that same pattern. You see that? And if you look really closely at these water jugs, those spots at the top, they're sort of reflecting in purples and blues, these little circles in the very divots in the middle. That reminded me a lot of this jar of confetti in these colors. And then I was looking at those and thought, huh, look at that whole pile of little colorful bowls. It's like confetti that's bigger. And then I was looking at those little bowls and I found a whole mess of colored pencils. And the mess of colored pencils all straight up and down in a row reminded me of these. A whole line of shipping containers. And if you see that one shipping container in the front, this one right there, this gray one, you might not be able to see it there, but there's little vertical lines in it. It's just the ridges of the container. All those little vertical lines are a little brighter shadow. It reminded me of all these little cracks in the paint. And all those cracks in the paint in a line kind of look like that bag around the onions. And then all those little lines reminded me of this. Now this, I believe, is an old radiator. And it's a little dented. So it's this up and down and up and down and up and down, really, really, really close together like fins. Well, that reminded me of that. Really good pastry with all the flaky laminations. But now they're curved. So when I saw that, those of us that are my age and older will know what this is. That's a phonograph, and all the little lines on it reminded me of this stack of paper cups. And then all those little paper cups and the pattern of light and dark kind of looks like this little light and dark pattern that you get with a whole mess of silver spoons. But it's that pattern, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, really close to each other. It reminded me of the texture of a pair of jeans. Maybe you can't see that very close. Yeah, there you can, now you can. And that light and dark and light and dark reminded me of the sunshine on the wall. And then when I saw that, I noticed how it happened the same way with this massive stack of chairs. But if you look over here, you get this almost fractured light and dark because of the way the sun is coming in. And it reminded me of that. And if you look at this really carefully, you can see as the lines radiate out, there's little horizontals, like almost like spider webs all the way around, but there's that center spot. And it reminded me of this. This only happens in a city where the puddles have these little oil drops and they make that center bullseye. And that is 30 pictures of We See. So as Rob put it to me when I did this, he said, before I met you, this series of connections would have seemed utterly scatterbrained because they're really non-essential connections. But all silliness aside, there is really something quite delightfully serious going on here. When we look at these things, we tend to want to identify what they are, to put them into conceptual categories. This is a radiator, those are spoons, these are chairs, those are pencils, and associate them only with the things in that concept and focus on the details that are important for making them in that category definition, and thus ignoring all the other little details. But the art of seeing and the ability to appreciate all the beauty around you comes from the ability to see all those other little details that we might otherwise ignore. So here is a fun card game, the equivalent of my Things of Beauty column, I think, inviting you to come along and join me when I say, I see, then you see, and then we all see. So we can see if we have any questions.
It was wonderful. If anybody has any comments or questions, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. Laura, briefly, what's your question? Go ahead, Laura. You can unmute yourself now.
Still muted.
As you described that, Sherri, it felt the exact description of how people need to view abstract art.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, the connections.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well,
it is interesting that we had a presentation on John Boyd, and he was talking exactly about this idea because what happens is that mostly people think of everything within a certain category. But in order to kind of think creatively, you kind of have to look at all the aspects of that, and then you separate it out from the category. The photographers have separated out an aspect out from the context in which it normally belongs.
Yes,
and then you put it all together.
Yeah. In his presentation, he actually took two things. I can't remember what they were. Snowmobiles and skis or something like that. Or maybe it was a motorboat and a snowmobile.
A tank and a ski.
Yeah, a tank and a ski. And then he broke all the parts apart, disassociating them from the tankness and the skiness of it, and then found other connections. So yeah, that was that last weekend?
Yep.
Yeah. So you can find his talk out on Meetup too.
Excellent. So next up is Rupali, Monica, and Ash. Rupali.
This is fantastic, Sherri. So I just want to say, this Shrikant stole my thunder, but I wanted to say the same thing about patterns and, structure. So basically, whether it's poetry, paintings, photography, what you're looking at is the structure, the rhythm, the cadence that you see going throughout it. And then when you look at these different patterns and you make connections within patterns, then you are also developing your own creative thinking. I use this kind of exercise with children to do creative thinking projects and thinking outside the box. Looking at things from their own perspective as opposed to what it actually is. But by making it tighter and looking at things really closely, you're removing all the other distractions and you're looking at one element. So I just wanted to make that point. And then the question there is, how many times do you have to do this to kind of train your eye? How often should you engage yourself in these activities to train your eye, to train your brain to start looking at patterns and looking at things of beauty?
I don't know that. I think I imagine it would take different amounts of time for different people. I've seen our kids. I would do this when we were driving to school and point out something in the clouds or the color, or the way the light was coming. But it's just introducing the way to connect it, and then I find if they're amenable to it, they just run with it, and pretty soon they're running roughshod right over you because they're seeing so many things that you didn't see. But I think, it's I don't know, Rob, are you ready yet?
No, I'm not ready.
Rob's not ready yet.
See, I have to say, I want to put in a plug for,
You're not on screen. You need to come in.
Okay. So I'm the one who finds, like, you have to put these in conceptual categories and define them by essentials and not be distracted by all these things. So this is what I find fascinating about this, is it's a way of taking what for me would be, here's what's important and here's what's not essential, and putting the important thing in the background and bringing what we would consider from a conceptual standpoint not essential, and bringing that to the foreground as the essential thing. And whether it's a spoon or a bowl or a table or oil on the ground, that's the non-essential part, and the essential is what's the shape. So that's a really kind of like inverting my whole way of looking at the world. So
he also makes me cook lasagna from a recipe book.
I know I'm stuffy.
I know. What can we do?
But I also think that you've missed an opportunity here. You should be plugging yourself, which is how often should you do this? Well, you should read Sherri's
You should read
column.
Things of Beauty every day.
Read Sherri's column as often as it comes out.
Wonderful. Next up is Monica, Ash, Jade, and Laura. Monica.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Sherri. Very interested in your comments. And these cards are interesting, the way the photographers lead us to see this detail. This calls me attention a lot to this. And I have one question. How would us living this pandemic times and living in big cities, how would we train our ability to see beauty in nature? With all the stimulus of the big cities, but how can we be connected to nature in our everyday life, sometimes not be able to be so, close to places like forests or, but how to try to do this everyday life of Russian,
These cards have quite a few. I mean, these were all taken in downtown New York. There's quite a few of these, and I'm just pulling them off the top of the deck. There's a little cactus, looks like a face, doesn't it, with two little red eyes? There's a lot of things just here. The eggshells, yeah, these are pretty cool. Check out the eggshells. So these cards actually will give you a little touch of that, and then when you can go to the park, you'll have your attention drawn to the undersides of leaves and the color. You see there's a yellow stem and the rest of the leaf is more of a bluish green, and in the shadows there's a different color. And then when you go to the park, your eye will be noticing these things because you've taken the time, because you've been in your apartment taking a look at them. So the deck, this whole maybe that's a house plant. Yeah, you're right. That could be just a house plant. So call the florist and say, send me some. So the deck of cards, by the way, I think it's about $35, the whole set. And it's the stacks are 2 stacks that are that thick. There's a lot to see. I mean, you can't shuffle these, not without breaking it into 4.
Next up is Ash.
Hi. Yeah, I love the discussion about looking for beauty, and it's an act, and it's a kind of a decision to look for these kind of patterns and connections and things, and using this We See game as a way of sort of training yourself to do that for them when you go out in the real world. And I was wondering if you've actually also heard of this game called Set. It's a simpler game with kind of visual pattern recognition. And it just has these cards with just very simple abstract shape, diamonds and wavy lines and ovals. And they have these different features, color, number, shape, and shading. And the purpose of the game is to collect sets. So you lay them out in rows, and then you collect sets that consist of 3 cards where either one of the feature or each individual feature is either all the same or all different on all 3 cards, which is a lot trickier than it sounds until you kind of get some practice and get the hang of it. So when you were going through that series of cards where you're noticing like one aspect that's similar on this card leading to the next, and then a different aspect leading you to the next, it reminded me a lot of this. So I was like, well, you could kind of use this game as sort of like training for that game, which is then training for going out and noticing others in the real world. So I don't know, I just wanted to mention that.
It's called
If you've ever heard of it.
I'm not familiar with it, but I know several people here must be. Yeah. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds exactly like the sort of thing I would love. Shrikant maybe find this disturbing, but when I was a kid and we were stuck in the car driving around, we had a little magnetic chess set. And so Shrikant's thinking, well, she's going to play chess. Good. No, what I did is I made patterns on the chessboard and then moved things around and then back this way and back that way and made, maybe they were tile pad. I don't know what they were.
We're a little set, sort of like a card game of these plastic geometric shapes, and you put them together to make, you're challenged to make a certain recognizable shapes.
I don't remember what that's called.
A person or something like that. They're just made out of little triangles. And
yeah,
squares.
it's a set of plastic, a spatial organization kind of game where this is the sort of game Rob doesn't like me to play with him because I beat the pants off him every time. But it's a series of different shapes. Some are squares and some are triangles and some are rhombuses and stuff like the rhombi. I'm not sure what the plural of rhombus is. And anyway, you get a card and you have to create, maybe it's a duck or it's a rabbit or whatever it is out of whatever pieces you have. I keep finding that game shoved deep in the closet because Rob doesn't like to play that one.
Bring it out for Oscar.
I'll bring it for Oscar.
Wonderful. Next up is Jade, followed by Laura. Jade.
Hi, Jade.
Hi. So my 2 cents is, first, I'm kind of feeling as though this is a visual exercise in identifying nuance. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And then something that I've been investigating for quite some time is the way that we teach children to see and identify things. It's almost the exact inverse of, like, I'm thinking in general education. Parents have very different ways of doing it, just like how you outlined. But I think largely, like, you go to school or preschool, it's the big blue ball, the big shaggy dog, or you're told what to hone in on and how to hone in on. And it kind of, I think, feels like, I don't want to say objectification, but it kind of does lead to it. Because if you're accustomed to identifying a whole lot of stuff like that, and then you're not brought into the concept of looking for nuance, you just stick with that, I don't know, it's a base, I don't want to call it base level because it's not base level. There is something in noticing something as a big blue ball or the flowery curtains or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. But it's to not be able to identify texture and all those other things. I just think that's interesting because also kids show us, like, I'm trying to figure out, where did this come from? Because a mother, you don't have to identify a mother to a child. Like a child doesn't learn who their mother is by someone saying her hair is this color, her this is that color, this is that color. Or in a family where everyone looks very similar, where I've been in a lot of those situations, and maybe aunt looks just like mom because they're siblings and they have similar styles because they've always been around. I don't think I've ever seen a scenario where someone has to go, no, that one's your mom, even though it's basically nuance that separates mom from aunt. So I'm just trying to figure out, where is it that we lose this? The concept of understanding nuance, is it trained out of us? Or is it just something that falls off? I don't know. It's just something that's in my brain to consider, but I have no answer.
There's, what were you saying?
Drawing on the right side.
Oh, the book Drawing on the Right Side. You're I'm sure, Jade, you're familiar with the book Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain.
Mm-mm.
It's an art school book on drawing, and it talks about the right and the left side of the brain, and there become, and I'm gonna botch this because I'm not a neuropsychologist. This is not my field, but there gets to be an age group where we tend to conceptualize things, and we tend to spend a lot of time essentially pruning the synapses in our brains. And I think if kids are not at that age, if they're not allowed to, if school is, it's all about this category, you know, math classes in math, and geography is only in geography class, and there's nothing to connect between them, that they tend to prune those things, those connections of those nuances. And that tends to happen, I think, more at that conceptual level when they're kind of entering into teenage years. I have somebody here who might want to jump in and correct me. Maybe not. But I think but it can also just be that it never happens, that kids don't ever have that ability to creatively follow that path, because kids are going to see things differently than the way the adults do, you know?
Well, can I throw something in here, which is, oh, sorry.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. Which is, the conceptual identifications are important, and that's part of learning and part of being able to, like, if you talk about all the members of family kind of look alike, and you know, it tends to be you know your family, you know your neighborhood, you know your little area, and perceptually you can tell the difference, you know, by looking at the fine details and nuance. You can tell the difference between everybody. But when you want to expand sort of into the wider world and be able to deal with a wider variety of things, you need that conceptual knowledge to be able to categorize things and look at it in that conceptual way. That's why I'm making a pitch for my side of things. But at the same time, I think what she's saying is that if you don't also continue the training, and the point of drawing on the right side of the brain is that drawing is training for remembering how to look at the details and and continue to see the details. If you don't continue that training, you can sort of put everything into these categories and lose the creativity and the nuance.
Yeah, I think art is a really important thing, and it's not happening nearly enough in schools.
I want to give the recommendation that Leonardo da Vinci had. He says, like, if you want to learn to see colors, because his whole theme was you have to learn to see. It's not automatic. You have to learn to see. And so he says, if you want to learn to see colors, go out during dusk, when the light of both in brightness and color is changing, and look at faces of people. Okay, because faces of people, our eyes are able to spot things about faces of people. There is color and color variation in the face itself, and the light is changing both in brightness and in hue, and you try to observe what is going on. So that was his recommendation to painters. Next up is going to be let's see, Laura, followed by Susan.
Yeah,
Laura.
Oh, still on mute.
Okay, yeah. I want to go back.
Oh, no, other Laura, not Laura Shapiro, the other Laura.
Oh, I'm sorry. So hello, everyone. Great to be here. Sherri, I want to say thank you for introducing, I mean, I heard it vaguely, but having me look more closely at the poem. Like, you know, I read that ahead of being here, and it gave me so much joy to just realize, yeah, you know, we know it, we read it in the magazine. Hold on to it, though. Hold on to that thing of beauty and allow it to stay with you. Along the lines of observing, and I think it was Rapali that was asking, how can you train your brain to do that? I've always been nature, and I love light and so forth. But once I got an iPhone camera, I was taking pictures everywhere. You know, it starts out with your family, right? But then wherever I go, and now I can hardly walk anywhere because I'm so distracted by all the things of beauty I see. And you used the word, I've never taken a photography class, but I think you used the word, Sherri, like tight. I think you said a tight photo.
Yep.
So the first time I did a tight photo, I did it by accident. The phone was on my lap, and I took a picture of my jeans. So then the beauty of the light on the jeans and the way, you know, the pattern in the jean fabric, it was super tight. And that just like blew my mind. It was so gorgeous. So I just wanted to say, a camera, using your camera wherever you are, and then just getting really close and taking a picture is mind-blowing for me. And like I said, everywhere I see the light, the shape, the color, that, you know, I want to take a picture of it. So that's a really easy way to train yourself.
Yeah, That's great.
And I have to leave at 4. I just want to tell you, it's not because I'm not interested, but coming for dinner.
There'll be a recording. There'll be a recording. So whatever you miss, you can catch on the recording.
Great. Well,
Wonderful.
thanks
So
for
we'll
doing
take-
this.
We'll take one more from Susan Lang, and then we'll go to the next Things of Beauty. Susan, go ahead.
I'm really enjoying this. Thank you so much. And by looking at those cards, Sherri, what came to my mind was when I compose something, if I can't name it, I can see it more clearly. And so by looking at those cards sideways or upside down, I often find myself taking, if you're drawing or painting something and you turn it upside down, you can see the shapes, you can see more deep, you really can see more detail if you can't name it. And that's what that sort of reminded me of when you're doing that, because I don't really look for objects if I can name an object, it's defeating to me. What I need to do is see the shape that the light reveals on a particular spot. I love those cards. I think they're wonderful.
You'll have to get yourself a set.
Wonderful. I do want to make one last comment. There is this book called Growth and Form, which looks at similarities of patterns in biological organisms. And it is fascinating because this is not just looking at the surface, by seeing the shapes of things and why things the way they are. You raise the question, but why these dissimilar things are shaped in a similar way? And that allows you to get at something fundamental. But prerequisite of that is for you to start observing these things at whatever, and these things vary in scale. It could be a giant scale or at a microscopic scale. And you have to be, and it could be a completely dissimilar context, but being able to see patterns across fields is crucial for further conceptualization as well.
Yep.
All right, Sherri, on to next. Go ahead.
Rob says I'm the page turner, so before we can go on, he gets to ask something.
All right. So I just wanted to ask a little bit, because you've done this with our kids. You haven't done this with me yet, this game. So how exactly do you play it? Is it a matter of just I know you have a lot of different options, but it's kind of like challenging each other to say, come up with a match for this?
You can do it that way. I mean, they have so many different ways to play it. When I was playing it with Oscar, we just we started playing it domino style. We took a bunch of cards and then we would not by points, and right. I'm not even sure if I actually know how to play dominoes, really. It's just, to me, it's you matching patterns, right? So we played it that way, but then we played it another time just making essentially a big spiral on the table of, match a card, match a card, match a card. Isn't that funny? Or isn't that interesting? Or, oh, look at that, how alike those things are. So, and they have the book is full of all sorts of, so many different options on how to play that I eventually put the book down and said, let's just play. That's what we did.
Okay.
Oscar is particularly good at this. I remember when we were in the car once and I just spoke some phrases and he started using that and started creating a little bit of music out of that. And then I went back and forth with words. And so we had this very nice riff going. So it works beautifully at musical level too. And like, if you look at people who are really good at music, like Ella, right? Ella Fitzgerald, that's what they do. So when they listen to music, the way she says, I steal everything I hear. And she takes all of that in and uses those patterns in her art. As she goes along, which makes it possible for her to produce things of incredible richness because she is taking in all the patterns.
Yeah.
All right, Sherri, next one.
Okay. So we're going to share a screen for this next two. So go there. Play and then forward. There we go. Okay, so this is a painting called A Virgin by Abbott Henderson Thayer. Now, for those of us that were in this series in the last 12, 14 weeks, I talked about this. Rob actually read a Things of Beauty column that I wrote on this painting back then. It's in the Art and Sense of Life lecture. So if you want to, Shrikant, if you want to put a link to that or flag that one for people so they know.
I will do that, but Sherri, feel free to repeat anything from there because it was beautiful. So go ahead.
I've got more to do though. That's why
Okay.
I'm not going to go back to that one. Anyway, Rob reads my column because I'm not able to read that column without breaking up. So Rob read that one and he read it about 25 minutes into the video. So if you're done hearing this one today and you want to go back to that one, that's where you can find it. But back then I didn't tell you that that was just part one of the Things of Beauty on this painting. I also wrote this part two about the use of color in this painting. So in the other one, I described how this is a portrait of the artist Thayer's daughter here in the center, and it's a tribute to her courage in taking charge of her younger siblings after the death of his wife, these children's mother. And what the painting shows is this eldest daughter in the center striding forward and leading her younger brother and sister. So for those of you who joined us last time, remember how we kept talking about how great art benefits from repeated viewing and from greater depth of analysis? Here is an example of exactly that. So this is part two of Thayer's A Virgin. When I finished writing about this piece, I kept finding myself, I wanted to add related comments about the color in this piece. So I've decided to take an entirely fresh look at this painting, just discussing the color in this work. Usually this is something I would do only standing right next to an original painting, but these days museums are offering high resolution photos on their websites like this one. And that allows viewers to zoom in closely and to study a painting without the risk of being yelled at by the docent. Truth be told, I often get yelled at by docents at art museums for getting too close to works of art. But I would never touch anything except for the Liberty Bell, which is another story, maybe for another day. So the first striking thing about the colors in this painting to me is this greenish yellow of the central figure's dress. This isn't a color we often see in artwork, and it's not often a color we see in fashion, as some would say, that's not a color many can wear. I think this is because humans seem to have an aversion to yellows that have too much green in them. I think it stems from reminding us of humans of icky things we'd rather not think about. And for that reason, it would really be the very last color you would ever expect to see in a doctor's waiting room. The phrase, "you look a little green around the gills," is a testament to how much we avoid this yellow-green color. And if you were to do an online search for yellow-green dresses, you wouldn't find this color. You would find a bright sunshiny yellow, a pale butter yellow. You would find probably a fresh lime green yellow, maybe a rich mustard yellow, and even a deep golden color of winter squash, but you're not going to find many dresses of this color. But then there are instances of yellow greens that are extremely appealing. Think of fresh spring leaves or a fresh pear, or even the spring, or even a field of ripening wheat often has a color similar to this. But in artwork, a painter's color choices, however conscious or subconscious, are never accidental. So it's always worth it to ask what effect comes from the color, from the specific color choices. When we look at what's accomplished by using this specific color, what effect occurs because of the choice? We can appreciate the painting then at a much greater depth. So let us all relax and let your eyes wander through this painting, really without conscious effort to try to guide your eyes to this spot or that spot. Just let your eyes be drawn through the painting naturally. And once you've mastered giving free rein to your eyes, engage enough of your consciousness to become aware of where your eye is going. Don't try to start affecting where your eyes focus next. Just be the detached scientist carefully observing his subject. It's tiring activity at first, I know, until you become more comfortable allowing your eyes to roam like this without direction. But you'll find that watching your own acts of observations, you will learn to notice many more details. When I started looking at this painting, I can't escape how the color of her dress so carefully blends into the grasses at her feet. The lower part of her dress more closely matches the colors of the grass and the plants in the lower portion of the painting. Notice the darker green shadows of the folds, how close in color they are to the leaves of the shrubbery around her. And the highlights of the folds of the fabric around her extended leg, they almost look like blades of grass themselves. Notice how we see similar shapes and colors in the background directly behind her, between her and her younger brother. Those background blurry blades of grass seem to extend from her dress, or rather, these very specific choices in color and shape help to make this woman look as if she is emerging out of the earth itself. But notice as your eye wanders up her figure, the colors change, more light bits of yellow, less dark green, until at her bust, we're seeing shadows in shades of greenish blue, colors that reflect the sunny blue sky above. Taken with the cloud wings behind her, you might wonder if Thayer is trying to tell us that she comes from the earth, but she is heading to the realm of the sky. But to take this idea as meaning in the painting, we need to see more than just one example of that in the painting. So let's ask ourselves, does she look as if she herself is becoming otherworldly? I don't see that. The only part of this woman that looks diaphanous is her left inner elbow. The highlight here on her arm makes her skin look almost transparent, but this is just where the sunlight is reflecting off her pale skin and nothing more. But if you notice what this extra bright spot of color does, it will lead your eye to another important part of the painting. Notice how this highlight creates a contrast to the darkened shadows of her younger brother. Imagine this highlight on her inner left elbow if it were significantly darker. Or better yet, look at the young boy in the painting while putting your hand up and blocking out the rest of the painting, except the highlight on her left arm. Do you see how much more the boy sinks into the shadow because of the brightness of that central figure? Our eyes are automatically drawn to stark contrasts. As infants, we use these strong contrasts to build our visual cortex. So it's no wonder that throughout our lives, our eyes are always drawn to such contrasts. In artworks, learn to notice how contrasts are used, and you will learn how an artist works to draw your attention through an artwork. So, what contrast do we see between the central figure and her younger brother at her side? The first big shift is in the color of the clothing. His reddish cloak is a soft contrast to her green-yellow dress. If you think of bright primary red and green Christmas decorations that blanket stores well before Thanksgiving, you'll know the power of those two complementary colors that sit opposite sides of the color wheel. They're called complementary colors, not because the two colors complement one another, but because they complete one another. As light, they combine to create the color of white light. At their most intense, these complementary color pairings are very eye-catching. Think of the complementary colors we would see in a sports team uniforms, like purple and yellow, or blue and orange, or the Christmas season explosion of red and green. These color combinations are extremely eye-catching, But such bold contrasts only work for a short period of time before they become tiresome to our color receptors on our retinas. But let's get back to this painting. It is a much more subtle red and green pairing. When complementary colors are muted into hues far from their primary versions of themselves, they still create a contrast that grabs our attention, but in a more gentle way. And because of this complementary color pairing, our eyes are drawn to the figure in the red cloak, but only after noticing the central figure first. If he were wearing a much brighter red, our eyes would go to that figure first. And that's not what Thayer wants us to do. So instead, consciously or not, he has chosen this muted red for the boy's cloak. And once our eyes rest on the boy, we notice that his details are far more loosely painted than hers. Without the contrast in his details, our eyes spend less time on this figure than we do on the central figure. Our eyes are drawn from his cloak to his sad face. Like contrast, our infant selves are constantly drawn to faces. We just can't help ourselves but to look at faces. The same thing holds true as we grow up. But once we're at his face, that's spare on the details, our eyes are craving more detail, and we find ourselves drawn back to the central figure, but this time especially to her face where there's detail. Having just spent time looking at the red cloak, our eyes jump to the matching red color of her lips. This detail causes us to notice the shape of her lips and notice that they're tightened slightly at the corners. Spending a lifetime of looking at faces, we recognize this set mouth as a determined look. And inevitably, when we see a set mouth, our eyes go to her eyes. And we notice her set gaze and recognize how different her gaze is from her brother's lost expression. And after our eyes have ventured up her left arm from her brother's face to the central face, we're drawn down her right arm to her little sister's face. Our attention here is drawn by yet another contrast. This time, the bright spot of sunlight on her forehead and on her face. Our attention, but again, we have softer details here. So our eyes search for contrast, and we're drawn to that red color again, and we spot not only her pursed lips, but that red embroidery on her green cloak. But then notice what happens next, another contrast. And our eyes are drawn to that bright yellow line, almost primary yellow, directly below the red on her cloak. Almost as if our eyes seek to find a match, our eyes spot the same hue down in the colors of the little roses that the little girl carries in her right hand. Had you even spotted that detail before? Our eyes are brought there by the color. And now your mind is thinking about flowers and why she's carrying them. And we suddenly notice this little girl's leg forward as she steps out of the shadows. It's almost as if now our brains are looking to find everybody's feet and legs, and our eyes are drawn down her leg to her right foot. Then we notice the central figure's foot and toes in much greater detail, the curve of her toes as she flexes into a step. And then notice how your eye is drawn from color to light color. And we then notice the boy's bare thigh and its very loose musculature, further telling us of his listless condition. As our eyes wander down past his knee and gets lost in the foliage at his feet, notice how your eye is drawn to the sharper detail in the stick in the boy's left hand. Our eyes travel up that bent stick to the shape of his loosely grasped hand. But notice what our eyes do when faced with something slightly blurry and out of focus like his hand. Your eyes unconsciously search for contrast to focus on. It finds that contrast in the far right of the painting on his left sleeve. Notice how much sharper of a contrast there is between the color of his cloak and the background at that spot more than any other part of the sleeve. Our eyes are captured again by this contrast, and we follow the curve of his cloak right back to his sister's arm, and zoom, we're right back at the eyes of the central figure, where we have enough detail to capture our attention and ponder what she's thinking. Personally, I find my eyes only pay attention to the clouds on the second pass to this figure's face. And this is the moment when my eyes travel upward and to the right from her face, along the edges of the clouds, another contrast, and they dance across the top of the frame along those little spots of white flowers to catch up with the fluffy clouds on the left. And then I find myself right back at her face and those penetrating eyes. And that's where I find myself at rest. It takes time to go through this kind of mental travel through an artwork. But how much more rich is the experience when you focus on the journey? And what's that line from the Keats poem? That things of beauty are made for our searching? How much more enjoyable is it to look at this painting after our previous discussion of the composition and the meaning of the painting, and then now looking even more deeply at the color of the painting and how the color helps aid in the meaning of the piece? How much more can you get out of a work of art? Well, I think we escaped. Okay, now we're going to try to stop share. There we go.
Stop share.
And we can take a couple questions.
Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Questions about this painting at this point? Laura, only about this painting, okay?
Oh, Laura, you're still on mute.
Just a second, let me.
Sorry, I wasn't going to talk about another painting, sure content. I wouldn't do that. I just wanted to say, would you consider looking at the color as form to function in this case, in this painting?
I think for many painters, color is most definitely part of it. Yes. But I think they all add up, all the details. It's the brush strokes, the composition, all those parts add up.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Dave.
Yeah, Sherri, thanks. And to me, her clouds, the clouds really frame her face. That to me is just zeroed in on her face.
Yes, yes. And for those of you that didn't catch the other presentation on this painting, it was a very, if those clouds look at all like angel wings to you, it was a deliberate attempt to kind of bring about the winged victory. So that stepping forward, prow of a ship, making her way through the world. That was an inspiration for Thayer for that painting.
Joe.
I just want to build on that really briefly because I almost noticed there was some color that was used like almost like a halo above like the idea, because it did look like an angel. That's what my initial thought was, the cloud structure itself. But then there was this almost circular color that was used that grabbed my eye.
Yeah. Thayer actually has another, he painted young children quite a lot. And I think maybe even it was his daughter in another painting. I believe it's called Angel, but it's much more deliberate connection. That's why I think this one is, he also put it next to the Winged Victory, a model of the Winged Victory.
Next up is Jade.
So I think you just forgot my question. I'm sorry.
We'll come back to you if you want.
Because I was kind of write something.
No problem.
Um,
We'll come back.
I don't remember what my question is. Can you come back to me? Sorry,
Yes,
I completely
absolutely.
forgot.
Absolutely, no problem. All right, Sherri, let's go to the next one.
Are you guys ready for the next one?
Oh, just a second. Wait a minute. Laura Workman. Laura.
Yeah.
Hey, Sherri, I've been looking at my iPad so I can see it better.
Yes.
And more close up. So yeah, and Zoom. And I just found, have you seen this other painting? It's very similar, called Virgin Enthroned. It appears to be his daughter, his children as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You can see that with my background. You can't.
Background, yeah.
The one you picked is, to me, a much more pleasing composition, but it's certainly her and the brother and sister on either side.
Yes.
Virgin Enthroned. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jade, go ahead.
Okay, so I went to art school. I've heard all different kinds of people say all kinds of different stuff about art and how to look at it and things like that. But I think hearing you speak, the question I have for you and your take on observing, period, and observing art is, how would you found the beauty in this painting? How would someone find a beauty in a painting, or I guess anything, in the event that they didn't have meaning to pull from? So if it's one of those things that I don't know who said it, but one of the women I thought was kind of poignant was, she gets more out of something when she does have a name for something. So yeah. I'm wondering, the event that you have a preconceived notion of the painting or of what it means or what certain things would mean. Like for instance, with the green, I have lots, like I also wear green every day. So I probably have lots of things with that colors. Concept of being an undesirable color or color, like you have probably, well, let me bile green because it's a little more palatable. Even bile is not palatable. That I'm about to paint a room. And so it's kind of like, how would you, how do you determine or feel to extract beauty from things that don't have, I guess, if they don't have the contextual meaning prior to observing it?
Yeah, and actually, if it's good to go back to the first part that I wrote about this, because when what I'm describing both in that thing of beauty and this one, now obviously it's several years later, but this is the thinking process that I have come to about that painting, because I had an immediate reaction when I saw this painting and I didn't know why. And so, and I don't usually try to find meaning by looking up. I try not to do that at first. I try to find the meaning in the work itself, about the composition and things like that. And so in that earlier part, I come to some discussion, some meaning of the composition and where that comes from. But it's important that you're able to get a meaning out of a work of art without having to have a book that tells you how to do it, right? It's really important for that to happen. And our whole last 10, 12, 14 weeks, we've been discussing aesthetics and art and sense of life and all these things. And there is what the artist puts out there, but there's also what the artist puts out there may or may not be received by the viewer. So it's what us as viewers are bringing to it too. So what I'm describing here is what I am seeing when I'm looking at a painting before I do research to say, okay, now I know it's this sad story of what happened. His mother, their mother died, and he's distraught, and here this young woman is stepping forward and taking charge. When I first saw it, it was a sense of life reaction, having no knowledge of that story. It was just this reaction of this woman, clearly something's not totally right, and she's handling it anyway, and it was only later that I was able to gather enough of those information to give a deeper meaning to it.
You know, Sherri, it would be wonderful if Rob could read the other piece.
There we go.
Okay, here we are.
All right, so now you can see that painting and then you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay. So this is, I'm reading Sherri's thing that I published as part of her column about 3 years ago. All right. I first became aware of this painting on a visit to the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. many years ago. I was at the museum that day to see something entirely different. And as you do when you're on your way somewhere, you walk past things fairly quickly and they catch little of your attention. Yet as I turned a corner to enter a staircase to another floor, I was stopped dead in my tracks by this large painting over 7 feet in height. It was hanging on a wall at the back of the landing. The location itself threw me for a loop, and I angrily asked Rob, why on earth would a museum hang something like this in a random staircase? See below for the actual reason. Truthfully, though, it wasn't the location that stopped me in my tracks. It was the painting that suddenly demanded all of my attention. The look of quiet determination on the face of the central figure, just as much defiant strength as there is gentle affection, very much resonated with me. Here was a portrayal of a woman who conveyed both tenacity and tenderness. The story behind it explains why. This is a painting of Thayer's 3 children, painted shortly after his wife's death, when the eldest daughter took charge of her younger siblings for a time. At a time of such grief, the father portrays his eldest daughter as the one who takes it in stride, gently guiding her siblings to move forward. Notice the difference between her facial expression and that of her younger siblings. The young brother on our right has heavily lidded eyes that reflect deep sadness. His gaze looks unfocused, as if he's unable to fully process what has befallen his life. His facial muscles are slack, the corners of his mouth droop downward, and he looks emotionally lost. The younger sister, by contrast, has a more quizzical expression, as if she's just starting to figure out this new world. Her eyes are fully open, her gaze is direct, her lips almost pursed together, with a mind full of questions. Then take a fresh look at the eldest daughter's face. Her eyes are bright and strongly focused. Her lips are not loosely slack nor pinched tight with emotion, but resolutely tight in the same expression that we all get when we are determined to do something. But notice also how Thayer uses shadow to depict the emotions on each face. The youngest daughter has the brightest highlight of happiness. The sun is sinking into the shadows, but the central figure has the most even light across her face. Please take advantage of your ability to zoom in on this high-resolution image to look deeply into her eyes. The evenness of light allows us to fully see both of her eyes, including the spark of a highlight in her right eye. We need this evenness of light to see the detail of her fixed gaze and the set corners of her mouth. He also uses much finer brushstrokes and sharper contrasts of line and color to draw our focus to her face. If you look closely at the younger children's faces, you see how much more loosely painted their details are. But perhaps you were most struck by the painting's title, A Virgin, and you were thinking that with the death of his wife, Thayer was portraying his daughter with religious overtones. After all, it probably hasn't escaped your notice that those clouds behind her sure do look an awful lot like wings, don't they? Here we have cloud allusions to wings and a title that alludes to the Virgin Mary, so is Thayer showing us a portrayal of his eldest daughter as an angel? I don't think so. Thayer was a naturalist early on in his life and spent a great deal of time painting animals, especially birds. And you often see his children portrayed with actual wings in other paintings, such as the one he actually titled Angel. But I don't think that's what he's trying to say here. Does this central figure remind you of any other great work of art? The forward-striding figure with wings outstretched behind her. Is this the Winged Victory, perchance? With the image of the Winged Victory in your mind, notice the flowing drapery of her dress and how the drapery billows out behind her on the breeze. Notice how the fine fabric is blown against her leg as she steps forward, and how the wind puddles the fabric into coils around her lower leg. By now, it probably takes conscious effort to see these clouds as anything but Victory's powerful wings. Charles Freer, who bought the painting from Thayer, certainly thought so. When he exhibited it in 1910, he had it placed alongside a plaster cast of the Winged Victory. Its normal location was in the landing of a grand staircase in his Detroit mansion, and it is in honor of his original placement in his own home that the museum chose the location for this painting. It turns out to be a good choice. No matter where it is placed, viewers would feel as if this life-size figure was stepping forward, but placing it at the back of a staircase landing forces the viewer to walk toward the painting, exaggerating the effect until it seems as if this figure is actually advancing towards you. When we think of the forward motion of the winged Victory positioned on the prow of a ship, it puts a different light on this painting, doesn't it? The winged Victory depicts the moment that Victory charges in, the moment she alights on the deck of the ship, wings still fully outstretched, wind flapping her clothing as the ship charges forward. How does this fit in with sad grief? I think we're seeing Thayer depicting a moment of parental pride in seeing the strength of spirit in his daughter in the face of grief. In the wake of his own sorrow, Thayer turns to his immense canvas to depict his daughter's inner self as a kind of mournfully victorious goddess. It is no wonder the painting stops you dead in your tracks. All right, that's back. All right, now we're back.
All right.
Right.
So we need to screen share for the next one.
Unless do
we want any questions on that?
Or is this
So if anybody has any comments about this, you can go ahead. But let's continue. Let's continue.
So now we need.
Thank you, Rob.
Here.
And go down here, share screen. Back to this. Okay, and we're going to go advance ahead, actually, in a moment.
Okay, so this next one is a portrait of Frederick Douglass. Since we've been talking about how important faces are to our visual cortex, we'll get to the picture in a second. I wanted to share one of my favorite discoveries while visually strolling museums here during the pandemic. It's an unexpected portrait of the great orator and abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. But before we look at the unexpected portrait, let's take a look at the Frederick Douglass portraits we all know. This is a Google screenshot of Frederick Douglass images. Notice that nearly everything is a photograph. This was back in the day when photography was kind of in its infancy. It was much more common to see portraits painted. But Mr. Douglass spoke out about the importance of seeing a Black man in photograph, of seeing a former slave as a man, as a human, as an upstanding member of civil society who had an obvious right to his freedom. He understood the power of portraits of heroes, and in his own home, the walls were covered with such portraits. And he understood that such an image would help forward the abolitionist movement. He worked so hard at this that I believe he was one of the most photographed people of his time. So why did he prefer photographs to painting? Well, it seems that he also understood the artist's ability to convey their own sense of life and their own values in their portraits. And it is said that he felt that most white men had so ingrained the idea of a subservient Black man in their minds that they wouldn't be able to show a former slave as a heroic being. He felt that a camera couldn't lie as much as a portrait painter could. So whenever and wherever possible, Mr. Douglass sat for photographs. So that makes it all the more interesting to find a painted portrait of him, and even more so, one that was done at the beginning of his career and just about a year before his narrative was published. Here I present to you the painted portrait of Frederick Douglass.
Oops.
You got to go forward.
I'm trying to.
Hang on a second. Okay, now go forward.
No, it's not letting me all of a sudden.
All right, hang on.
You know, in theory, all this
when
feature
I
works.
touch the button, it works.
Okay.
Okay.
You better.
This painting was formally attributed to Elisha Livermore Hammond, a fellow abolitionist and a painter, though I'm having a really tough time finding out much about his paintings. It seems now, though, perhaps Mr. Hammond may have had something to do with the painting being made, but now they no longer believe it was actually that he actually did the work. I've reached out to the Smithsonian for more information, but with the pandemic, I haven't gotten very far on this research. I've also heard that this portrait may have been related to the frontispieces of his narrative when they were published. Those frontispieces images show drawn portraits, like this one from the University of Michigan's library. See the similarity? And this one from the New York Public Library collection, or this one from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Now, they would have used a black and white drawing for the frontispiece because it was a published journal or published book, and the printing technology of the time, they wouldn't have done a color rendering of it. So it's quite possible that these were drawings were made instead of a painting specifically for that, for the issue of publishing it only in black and white. But you'll notice that in all three of these images, Mr. Douglass is wearing the same outfit and is generally in the same position with a similar expression. I suspect that each of these printings of his narrative had their own engraving prepared for print. And from my eye, they all look to either to be copies of one another, or they're all copies of this original portrait. Let's go to the original portrait. Okay. And if this oil is in fact the origin of all those frontispiece images of the paintings, of the printings of his narrative, then why do we not know who painted it? Did Mr. Douglass not like this painting of himself? Out of all these questions, I don't have answers, but the skill in this portrait is so extraordinary that I believe it has become my new favorite portrait of Frederick Douglass. So let's set aside the mysteries of history and let's take a look at this painting. Now, we've been talking a lot about color contrasts and contrasts in levels of detail and the ways that our eyes are pulled through a work of art. So let's use those skills here. We see a striking portrait that immediately pulls us in. The background is minimal and softly focused, so it doesn't grab our attention. But notice that right around the figure's face, the background color changes. Instead of the warm amber hues, we see cooler tones dominating. These cooler tones are a complementary color contrast to the warm undertones of Mr. Douglass's skin. His face is made more prominent by the contrast to the background, and it seems to project forward from the canvas because of that contrast. The figure is seated and dressed in a fine dark suit. Some highlights along the shoulder seam and of the lapel here on the left and across the knot of his tie make sure that we notice that he is wearing gentleman's attire. The brightest spot in the painting, of course, is his collared white shirt. It's natural for our eyes to be drawn to the lightest colors in a painting, just like it's easy to pick out the highest notes of the violin over an orchestra. But notice that the details of the white shirt are purposefully vague. Below the tie, we see vague folds that create vertical shadows that seem to direct our eye to the important stuff above. And the spot that is most detailed of this shirt, it's the crisp edge of this collar point on the left. Again, notice how strong the contrast is here. It's in great contrast both to the dark suit below and the shadow of his jaw above. Like the highlights on his lapel, our attention is drawn to this detail. We are not allowed to ignore the fact that this Black man is wearing a learned man's attire. The artist had something very important to tell us here, and we are not allowed to continue to the details of his face without first acknowledging the clothing on his body. Now, to us, it may just be another 19th century dark suit, and thankfully, we've made it so far that the suit is no longer startling or shocking to us, but it sure was back then. It was clearly important to the artist, and we know from Mr. Douglass's text, it was important to him for it to become commonplace to see a Black man in gentleman's attire. He understood the power of imagery. Now, let us take, can we go forward?
Oh, yes.
Let's allow our eyes to take in his face and notice all of the details. We know from the many photographs of Frederick Douglass that this is a very good likeness. We may be more used to seeing photographs of him from later in his life, but we can all see that this is very much the same man. To me, it's a treat to see him in the early stages of his career. Not so long after escaping slavery and just at the point of publishing his powerful narrative. For me, when I see an artist's portrait of a specific person, I want to see emphasize those things that make up the essential elements of that person's character. To hit all of my own sense of life buttons, I want the artist to stress the same things that I see as supremely important about this person. And I see those things in this portrait. Notice the muscles in the jaw. The jaw is hard set, but not clenched in anger. The muscles at the back of the jaw, they bulge out slightly when we set our jaw. This isn't the soft, relaxed face of a man at leisure. This is the jaw of a man set with determination of an urgent purpose. He is not messing around. He has things to do, and he most assuredly will get them done. You also see this in his mouth. Notice his lips are firm, not slack, but also not clenched. The corners of his mouth are slightly pulled, not in a smile, but with a strength of mind and purpose. The shadow along his cheek from nose to mouth shows that this cheek muscle is engaged. And speaking of engaged facial muscles, go ahead. I bet you've noticed his slightly furrowed brow. See the shadow between his eyebrows? Again, this isn't the deeply furrowed brow we might see if a subject were angry or puzzled. This is a set expression of resolve and strength of character. But we also see that one slightly raised eyebrow. This is the expression of a man who wholly understands what he sees and is questioning why others cannot see what is so utterly plain to him. This detail, along with the learned man's dress, show us that this is very much a man of intelligence. But I've kept you from your visual destination for too long because I've talked about everything but the one thing that you were most likely drawn to when you first viewed this portrait. And that's his eyes. It doesn't matter where you force your eyes to focus. If you let your gaze fall naturally, you will inevitably end up right back here, right where the artist wanted you to be, looking into these intelligent eyes with their fierce gaze and determination to his purpose. And remember how we've talked about how like colors draw your eye? Where else do you see that specific hue of his eyes, this rich amber color? Well, we see it all around his head in the background, but in a much more muted version of the color. It's like we've been searching for the brightest, most intense version of this hue, and we find it in these penetrating eyes. So what do all these details add up to? This artist is showing us a portrait of Frederick Douglass as a man with steely strength of character, a man with great dignity and deep intelligence. We see a young man about to begin a career as a powerful speaker, author, and activist. We see a man who is no longer a slave by his own courageous actions. We see a hero. So, with the greatest respect to the man who so strongly preferred photographs to painted portraits, I'm going to have to disagree with him on this one point. This artist, whoever that was, has captured the very essence of his character by emphasizing the details that are most important. And as much as I understand and approve of his goal of becoming the most photographed man, I think he missed the potential of what art can do, of what this artist has done. And boy, do I wish I knew who accomplished that in this portrait.
Oh, the end.
All right, so we don't need to share screen anymore. We have one more after this, but we can take questions.
Let's do one thing. We're running a little late.
Yeah,
So
that's
how
your
about,
fault, Shrikant.
I know it's all my fault and all my credit.
The last one's very short.
Yes, so let's do that and then we'll take questions.
Okay.
Now change of pace.
Now a very big change of pace. I love tools. I love good tools, that is. I grew up around tools. I believe that my father is one of those people who believes that he who dies with the most tools wins. I too have a great many tools, but I'm pretty picky about which ones I keep and which ones I want to drive my truck over. So we use tools in so many aspects of our lives, but it seems to me that we are often fine with fairly useless tools. You know, that screwdriver that always strips out the screws, that kitchen whisk that can barely mix, the stapler that only sometimes staples. I have one of those.
Yeah, I know.
I'm always on the lookout for really good tools, the ones that do what they're intended to do, and they do it so well that I can hardly think of an improvement. And quite often, somewhere behind each of those tools is a person who's thinking very carefully about every aspect of the design of this tool and painstakingly removing every element that is unnecessary. So I present to you my bench scraper. A bench scraper, for those of you who don't cook or bake, the bench refers to the countertop or your work surface. And a bench scraper is a really useful tool that can be used for so many different jobs. For soft things, it can be a chopper, it can be a scraper, it can be a divider, a measurer, a cleaner upper, a folder, or a mixer. My bench scraper is used for all those tasks nearly every weekend. But it's not just that a tool is so versatile that puts this tool on my beautiful tool list. It's that this tool has everything it needs to have to work really well and absolutely nothing else. Really good industrial design comes from the process of eliminating each and every detail that isn't absolutely necessary. So if you Google bench scraper, you're going to get a bewildering variety of options. You'll find things with handles of every shape and every material. Some of the handles are comfortable to hold once you have them in your hand, but if they're sitting flat, you need one hand to pick it up and the other hand to grab it. That requires both hands. To me, when I'm working, I just want to reach over, pick up the tool, and find it's already in the correct position for working. I just want to reach over, grab it, and not even think about it. It's ready to go. So if the purpose of a tool is to make a task easier, then a really good tool eliminates unnecessary motions. So the coiled end, I don't know if you can see that. Let me see, how do I do this? Can you see that?
That's good.
The coiled end of this bench scraper, where am I here? Seems to be the perfect diameter to match the natural curve of my hand, so that the very same act of grabbing it to pick it up is the same motion for using the tool. And not only, but that's not the only thing that I love about the coil of stainless steel that makes up this handle. I love that there isn't a single edge or crevice for any ingredients to get stuck in. All of those other bench scrapers with handles require all that cleaning along the edge. I know, I've done it. I can't even imagine cleaning up the tight corners of some of those bench scrapers that are shaped sort of like dustpans with little edges. And the bench scrapers, I've had them in before, the ones with wood handles or plastic handles. Each material has a different expansion rate. And the parts eventually work loose, especially if you happen to just toss your bench scraper in the dishwasher like I do. But with this one, there's no place for anything to get stuck. The coil, I don't know if you can, let's try to see if you can see this. The coil of the metal, see that? It doesn't touch. It just coils around, and there's an opening there. You can see it in the shadow there. That little opening means there's absolutely no place for junk to get stuck. Plus, that coil gives it a little bit of spring. So when I'm working on a work surface and pushing, it gives it a more comfortable handhold. But then the manufacturer or designer of this bench scraper thought to add another special touch to the tool. Let me see if I can get this. So do you see up along the top and along the side edge, measurements. So I don't need to pick up another ruler. I have one tool. If I need to do anything that requires a measurement, it's right there, right where I need it to be. And you can even find these that will do it in either English or metric measurements. So a really excellent tool is a thing of beauty. But this one is also a really wonderful example of form follows function. And that brings me to the end of this group of things of beauty, but right at the beginning of next week's discussion of Louis Sullivan and his idea of form follows function.
Wow. Thanks. Thanks, Sherri. So what we're going to do, folks, is that we're running a little late. So let's go to questions. So if you want to ask questions, go ahead and type a exclamation mark in chat.
Yeah, I didn't see any of that.
Folks, have put links for all the items that Sherri discussed in the chat. Joe, just a second. I want to make sure you can unmute. Go ahead, Joe.
Oops.
So I might be asking the same thing that Laura asked a little bit earlier, but with the idea of removing unnecessary functions, and do painters essentially, and artists, approach it pretty much the same way, in the sense that they're removing like kind of anything that would be pulling you away from what the intent of the photo itself. So the Frederick Douglass painting would be a good example of that, where you mentioned that you wanted to, where the eyes, like that's where the artist wanted you to go. Mm-hmm. So does an artist essentially approach it the same way, and essentially design is done the same way even for buildings?
It can be. I'm going to say that it can be. It isn't always. But think about when we started this whole series of Romantic Manifesto, there's an example, I think, in the introduction, maybe I'm in the wrong chapter, where Ayn Rand talks about imagine an artist who shows a painting of a beautiful woman with a cold sore. That's not an essential element of who that woman is. Or if it is, that's saying something about that artist's sense of life, that thinks that the most important thing that they're putting on the canvas is that cold sore. So when it comes to something that's created from scratch, paintings, sculpture, these are things that come from either a block of stone or an empty flat thing with a bunch of clay in a block, or a canvas that's empty. Everything you put into it is something you chose to put there. So in a way, yes.
Next up is Jade, followed by Maritza.
I guess my question is kind of made about the Frederick Douglass portrait, because a lot of what I'm hearing is that we don't know why he didn't like the portrait, or why he didn't claim the portrait is more of what is. But as this brings me back to context, like without knowing the context, I think it's easy to kind of the image as like a great example of portrait. But even when we look at all of those images of Fred Douglass, a lot of them look different. I don't know all of which of them were photos, if he was able to take a color photo, but even right now, I don't watch the news, but I even know that there's a whole big thing now, even on the public front, but the way you're depicted, the colors that used, which is one of the things that are big about paintings, can be used for each side, and he was in the middle of a conflict. One side could portray him closer to their side to align himself them, and the other can portray him another way. And from what I understand, he might have somewhere in the middle because of his family lineage. I don't know enough about it to say. I know that the pictures of him that you will Google give you you don't know what to think, because he's portrayed in so many different lights, tones, and colors.
Yeah.
So, and then it's slavery. So it's like one of the biggest things, we have control over yourself when your image is actual symbol, something to be controlled. So again, I'm feeling the context of how we look at these images. I don't know what they about it. I say I don't know what something is forming in my brain, but context gives so much, so we convey what's there, what's missing, what might be missing, what this might say, what this might not say.
Mhm.
I'll leave it at that. I'm just rambling because I don't have a point. It's more like a strange question about something I am trying to figure out.
Yeah,
Because it's a big issue right now, as people are portrayed, and have control over how their images are controlled and modified.
Yeah, and this is something you and I have talked about in previous meetups too, that, you know, you change the lighting and you can totally change things. That's why, and I totally understand, that's why Frederick Douglass did sit for portraits, and he chose, I'm positive that there are times when he was in control and in the need to have some control over what that looked like. For me, yes, there is the question, was the artist saying something in that we don't know? We don't know that. Did he dislike this particular portrait? We don't know that. Honestly, when I look at it, I see that portrait as the origin for the drawings that became the frontispieces of his first published work. That to me means that he chose those drawings. They came from somewhere. I think he must have chose for people to make that illustration for publication from that painting. But what disturbs me is the fact that we don't know who the painter is. To me, I'm totally saying this, having not had the chance to do the research, and that's what I'm trying to get to. But my concern is that it's quite possible that the reason we don't know the artist is because the artist may have been Black. And an artist that was Black at that time may not have been allowed to sign their work. That's a really critical thing. Every painter signs their work. This is a painting that doesn't have a signature, and that's disturbing to me.
Next up is Maritza.
Hi, so looking at the Frederick Douglass painting, what comes to mind for me is eyes. So, you know, things of beauty. For me, it's, so I can admire a painting that has eyes in it. And I really love, you know, the gallery of self-portraits. I myself cannot hang any art with eyes. Like, I just can't do it. So I'm curious, I'm fascinated by, I mean, I can look at that painting and I can acknowledge that definitely what they're calling attention to is the eyes. Mm-hmm. But for me, there's a bias there, right? So the question I would have is, what tool or mechanism could or should, or do we even need a tool for when we view artwork that, you know, we can see clearly that there's something that is more attention grabbing than the other aspects on the canvas. And yet our bias is telling us that that's a negative thing. What does one do in that case? Does that make sense?
Can you give an example maybe to make sure that I'm following?
So looking specifically at the Frederick Douglass, all of the Frederick Douglass well, they're not self-portraits, but the paintings. So to me, the eyes, they're creepy. I mean, yeah, I know creepy is not a very scholarly descriptor, but it's a, like, especially specifically in the one you were looking at, I feel like the eyes are overly exaggerated. And to me, they look like they're just bigger than what should symmetrically be the case. And they're piercing, which is impressive, but also it like almost cringing to me. Like, but again, I'm saying this, letting you guys know, I have a severe lack of tolerance for eyes in artwork whatsoever. I have 1,000,004 nieces and not one of them is on my walls. Well, unless they're not looking at the camera. So just, I guess, not that I want to say it takes away from the enjoyment of the artwork, but if I were less self-aware of this bias of mine, it would bleed into my perception of the art. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, or is it immaterial? Is it just part of what makes me me?
I think it's what you're bringing to the artwork. And I think that's what every one of us as individuals, that's the interesting thing about artwork. The artist puts something out there and we as viewers bring our own ideas to it. Personally, for me, I am very much drawn to those eyes, and those eyes are challenging. You know what I mean? They're challenging, but I can imagine I wouldn't want that above, the desk that I'm writing at, because I would feel like he was saying, are you sure you want to say it like that?
Right. Absolutely.
But there are places, and that's where you choose. If you're putting it in your own house, you have to choose what's right for you.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
One quick thing I want to say, I don't know if everyone has ever heard of a self-portrait poem, but if you ever get bored enough, Google it. It's fascinating to see someone paint themselves with words. Thank you.
Interesting.
Thank you.
I also just wanted to point out that gee, those eyes just may be a little too intense is kind of a normal thing to say about a 19th century portrait. It was sort of the style of the time, very intense, dark, brooding eyes was sort of a standard way of doing a portrait of someone, especially someone considered visionary.
And it was outside of a standard 19th century approach. It was very specifically Frederick Douglass's approach. When he sat for a portrait, a photograph to be taken of him, he did not have photographs of him yucking it up. I'm sure there were some times in his life where he was laughing at somebody's joke, but that is not how he chose for his portraits, his painting, not portraits, paintings, photographs to be made. Every time he was ready to click that camera, remember, it's not like today where you have paparazzi, they'll catch every mood you make. No, this was a slow, deliberate thing. He made sure when that camera was triggered, he had that look because it was deliberately his choice.
Next up is going to be Susan, followed by Dave. Susan.
There we go. Frederick Douglass's portrait. I just finished a dozen portraits for sketched out for a book, and what I find is when you get into a portrait, you really get to observe more the character of the person, more so than in a photograph. If I'm drawing off of a photograph, that's a small instant of time, a flash of time, where it catches and freezes your face in that time frame. But an oil painting, especially then, he probably, he met with them, you get to see their facial expressions, you get more of their character. I think an oil painting always reflects more character than what a photograph does, because it's such so much of an instant. And that painting was striking, and the artist
controls your where he wants you to look.
He or she.
You always, and so the eyes is where he wanted you to look. Could have been in the set of the jaw too. So to show his determination. But I think an oil painting shows more character, or can emphasize the character more than what a photograph does. Just an observation on that.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Next up is going to be Dave.
Yeah, Sherri, I'm going to be very politically incorrect, and I may be sticking my mouth or my foot right into my mouth. But the portrait, I looked at that face and I saw a European face.
I did too. Me too.
Well, I'm glad I say, because I know this is a terrible thing to say, but the lithographs, I mean, I get an image, a distinct image of a person, and I see that portrait and I don't see the same face. And I'll be honest with you, the name that came to my mind is Dean Martin. And I don't know if you put one on one side and one on the other and compared, but I mean, you would have to have, microscopic measurements of features, this, that, and the other. And the other thing is, maybe it was trying to predate it or whatever. I mean, because our faces change over time. We all know that maybe he might have looked like that 20 years ago or 20 years prior to the portrait. And I will say politically incorrect, I've seen a lot of black faces and I've never seen one that looked like that. And the other thing about your theory of the portrait artist is the converse, is that I suspect he may have done portraits of 100, 200, 300 European men as a European artist. And if it ever came out that he did a portrait of a black man, it would have been the end of his career. So he couldn't have signed it. I'm just saying there could be that point of view also.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's equally disturbing. Yes.
Yeah. But anyway, I just want, because I felt that so deeply, I just had to say it, even though I know it's politically incorrect. But thank you again for leading us through this journey.
Yeah. If you look, most of the photographs that we know of Frederick Douglass are later in his life. There are some photographs where he is closer in age to this portrait, and you'll see there is a lot of similarity. Faces, when they're that young, they look more babyish than we never look that way when we get older. And Ash is putting here, there's a couple people putting comments here in the chat session, in case you didn't know, Douglass's father was a white slaveholder. So you do see some of that in his face. But if you go back to that portrait, you'll also see and I didn't get time to put this in the piece I wrote, you'll see a highlight along the edge of his nose in that portrait, that oil painting portrait. I think partially that's there to show that, the shape. But I also think that there's enough extra emphasis on that they're trying to show this is the actual shape of his nose. And so I think actually, I see where you're coming from, but I think that it actually is a fairly realistic portrait of what he looked like at that age.
Next up is Rupali.
Thank you, Sherri. So I'm going to go back to the poem from Endymion by John Keats, and he starts with, "A thing of beauty is a joy forever, and its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness." And from everything that you've shown us, you've talked about color, words, you've talked about geometry, you've talked about nature, you've talked about the sensory elements. To you, what are the elements that make up a thing of beauty? I'm sure it's different for everybody based on their sense of life, based on their outlook. But for you, what do you look for when you look at and you say, this is a thing of beauty for me?
It's actually kind of interesting. When I was doing this week or daily for week on end, I would set aside time to relax and just surf the web. And I would wander through little rabbit holes here and there, whatever kind of caught my eye, specifically to find things. And it would be like a toddler wandering through a field, you know, it's that kind of sometimes aimlessness. But I would wait until things really struck me. I would go to certain places, like there was a few places that had a professional photography blogs, and I would go there and scroll through. They had this wonderful feature where you could get the most up-to-date photographs that, you know, their 1,000 people would show. So I would regularly comb through and search through those to find photographs that really grabbed me. When it comes to tools, I'm on everybody's tool catalog list, so that just comes to me. And I test things out, I try things out. I'm really fussy about the tools that I use, including writing tools. So there was, back when I was doing this as a regular column, I took the time to go to the office supply store and buy one of every pen. And I did a whole thing about what writing tools I like, because I tend to write really hard and most things are scratchy and it slows down my writing, and it doesn't make writing fun.
And you have to spend a lot of time running down my favorite pilot.
Yeah, and I still run down Rob's favorite every time I grab a pen, and it's that I yell, "Why do we have these in the house?" And he complains, but then we get on with it and everything's fine. But for me, I want a writing instrument that just flows. So it's about tools. Really, a lot of it comes to form follows function when it comes to those things. Sometimes it's things of, you know, beautifully crafted things, things that provide that little spark of joy, that make every day a little bit more special. I once wrote about my love of antique table linens. I have quite a collection, and you can pick them up for a song. So, but they're gorgeous. The fabric flows in such a beautiful way. The iron, I mean, I'm not a real fan of ironing, but once a year, literally, it's probably that once a year, I get into this, it's a perfect day to iron, and I'll iron a whole bunch of tablecloths and table linens, and then they're all ready to just whoosh out on the table. And I wrote about that. And if you guys remember, we looked at Linda Mann's paintings one day. Linda and her husband Andrew were in on one of our early meetings on art and sense of life. I got an email from Andrew one day that, having read that Thing of Beauty, and if anybody knows Linda Mann's paintings, she's a still life painter with all these interesting objects in her painting. And he took her out shopping at the antique shop to find an antique tablecloth so that it could be part of her painting. I was like, best thing ever. Somebody else bought it before I could. So I don't have that painting. And I keep looking every time. It's like, is there another antique tablecloth in there? You know, but so it's things, all sorts of elements of my life, you know, water jugs, art. When it comes to art, it has to be, if you got to write about it, it's gotta grab you in the gut, you know? So it's my sense of life responding to something. So there were times when people would send me things, and I tell everybody, yeah, you can send me any suggestion you want. Do not take offense, because I can only write it if it's really got me important enough to be able to spill out and have something to say about it.
Wonderful. I think we're coming up on 5 o'clock. So let me tell you about what we are doing next week. Actually, let's take 2 more questions. Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's keep the questions brief. JS followed by Les, and then we're going to talk about what we're going to do next time. JS.
Hi, I really appreciated that in the poem. I think they said you could plug in your own modality for what kind of art you like, and for me, it's sound and music. Although this was more visually oriented, it taught me that I can exercise my muscle of vision to appreciate these things more, and also that I have a choice to choose to see the beauty versus the ugliness. Now with music, I'm always looking for the beauty. I want to know, can you do a class like this for music to exercise my auditory ear?
Yeah, you've got Rob's really interested on that. I did occasionally write about pieces of music and things of beauty, but it's more difficult. I usually wrote about smaller pieces because it's a little bit easier to do, but it's something that Rob is actually finishing. Did you finish last night?
I just finished an article.
He just did finish
about
a piece.
Beethoven. Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I just did the first movement. She kind of didn't do the whole thing.
Okay.
Talk to you before I go doing the whole thing.
Okay. Sounds good.
But yeah, that's a great idea.
Excellent. Next up is Les.
Hi. I just as Sherri started this here with this poem and everything here today, there's something that really struck me, given the pandemic and everything, and how we can't see this particular virus, and we know it's ugly, but we can't see it. There was somebody 6 years after that poem was written in 1824 by name of Elizabeth Wade. And she wrote this poem. It's only 4 lines, but I think it kind of captures the essence, another way of looking at beauty that extends beyond things to actually actions. Because as you know, like values, if you want to keep them, you have to take actions. And here it is. Virtue's the chief beauty of the mind, the noblest ornament of humankind. Virtues are safeguard and our guiding star that stirs up reason when our senses err. That's by Elizabeth Wade. She was age 13, 1824. So I thought that's really good. Given Iran was the philosopher of the morality of reason and how she tied, aesthetics into reason and everything. I think we can't underestimate reason, especially in a pandemic, And just one other thing I thought I'd mention, listening to everybody that I didn't hear come up. I really enjoyed Sherri's presentation today on things of beauty. And I thought what really struck me was that we got to realize that I think that there are, when we look at things conceptually, there are standards, there are properties that define the way an object looks and feels objectively. So that, and those particular standards, they give rise to that feeling of joy. I didn't hear that too much, but that's kind of the end result. We want to enjoy things, the happiness. And I think getting to points like Rebelli's sharing, like what do you look for and everything exactly like that. And if we had these categories, what to look for in nature, patterns, colors, all that together in one book, wouldn't that be great to go and look at? So we could incorporate into our daily lives. And I got that book for you. It was published in 2018. This person's actually from, I think, New York. So sure you'll know about, maybe even know her, But I'll give you the book. I'll just give you the subtitle. You'll get the idea. It's called Joyful, The Surprising Power of Ordinary Things to Create Extraordinary Happiness.
Les, would you be able to type it in the chat so everybody gets it?
Yeah, should I just, it's by Ingrid Patel Lee, just in case I have trouble with that.
Sure.
Okay, that's just what I thought I'd mention that to you. It's a great book. it gets into like your first photograph, like on the jewelry and stuff, and how looking at circles, just things that are circles, really are so pleasant for you.
Thank
Your
you.
brain just thrives in that, your mind. So yeah.
Thank you. I'll look that up. Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you, Les. And if you could put it in the chat so everybody can have it. Thank
Yeah.
you. So folks, this is what we're going to do next. Sherri, you want to say any closing comments before we talk about Louis Sullivan?
I had